considering that role of CTO, it wasn't something that you were at least immediately fond of, because Flextronics wasn't necessarily known as a technology-first company, if I'm paraphrasing correctly. Could you maybe expand on that story a little bit?
Yes, that's a story that's been told a few times, sometimes from my perspective, sometimes from others. And I'm sure different people have a different point of view. But our company, Nchip, was 2 blocks from Flextronics, and I had never heard of Flextronics. When we were introduced to Flextronics by one of our investors who had also invested in Flex, I got to learn what Flex was doing. Michael Marks, who was the CEO of Flex, and he and I have developed just a great relationship. You know, when he was the CEO of Flex and I was the CTO, that was a relationship. In fact, Harvard Business School did a few case studies on Flex, and in several of them, they mentioned that relationship. And then we went on to start Riverwood together, and then we started Celesta together. So we've worked together for 30 years. But when we first met, I didn't know anything about Flex, and I didn't know anything about him. And they made an offer to acquire our company, and it was fine. We were a startup, and I think it was a good acquisition in that the investors did very well. And I was asked by Michael to be the chief technology officer of Flextronics. When he first asked me to take that job, I was not happy. I was really upset. He and I were sitting at a table, I think we were having lunch, and I got up and I left and walked away and went back to the office. And he came and he said, "What was that about? I thought you'd be excited about this job." And I said, "I think it's the world's shittiest job." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Why does a company with no technology need a chief technology officer?" And he said, "Well, that's what I want to change. I think you're the guy who can help us change that." I said, "I'll think about it." And I was actually going to be on a flight that weekend. And he said, "Well, when you're on the plane, why don't you think about it and tell me what the job would have to be for me to take it?" And when I was on the plane, I wrote him an email outlining what I would want that job to be. And basically, I said at the time, I want to redefine the role of chief technology officer. Instead of being a guy who is developing processes and widgets in a lab that somebody else has to commercialize, I want to use technology as a way of creating new businesses inside the company. And he responded and said, "That's exactly what I had in mind." I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what he said. And then, as they say, the rest is history. We've had just a wonderful relationship. You know, he says often that he's not a technologist and everything he knows about technology is what I know. He and I often would say we don't know whose ideas. People always ask us, so whose ideas was it to do this or do that or whatever. We didn't have a chief strategy officer. The chief strategy officer was he and me. And, you know, we were the ones who started every Skunkworks project. You know, usually Skunkworks stuff start at the bottom and bubble up. We were the ones at the top who would start all these Skunkworks projects. And oftentimes people would say, "Well, which one of you guys had the original idea?" And we can't remember because we used to talk probably 5 or 6 times a day. I used to have a cricket ball in my office. He'd come sit in my office and we'd toss the ball between each other and talk about stuff. And at the end, we would just coalesce onto an idea, and then we knew what our roles were. My role was to go execute it, and his role was to fly overhead cover and keep the enemies off of me. And in many cases, the enemies were internal.